Horror Nights presents 4 terrifying and disturbing cabin-in-the-woods stories. Number 4. The People in the Cabin. Sean Gleason's cabin was deeply secluded in northern Ontario, Canada. It was the last house at the end of a dirt road that didn't even have a sign. Many people drove by it without ever knowing it was there. In the 30 years that he owned the cabin, Gleason had never come across another soul while on his land. On April 20, 1993, Gleason drove from his home in Sudbury, Ontario, to the cabin, which was about 4 hours north. When he arrived there, he noticed tire tracks in the mud near the cabin. However, he got an even bigger shock when he opened the door. Gleason had never smelled a dead body before, but he instantly knew that's what he smelled. Thinking it was a dead animal, Gleason plugged his nose and walked in. When he got inside his 2-bedroom cabin, he was shocked to see 4 dead bodies. Gleason didn't get a good look at them, but all of them were bald and they were all wearing white tracksuits. Gleason drove half an hour to the closest telephone and he called the police. When the police went inside, they found the bodies had been dead for at least 4 days. There were 3 men and 1 woman, and all of them were completely hairless. They were wearing white tracksuits made from cotton, and all of them were sitting cross-legged in a circle when they died. An autopsy report was performed on the 4 bodies, but the medical examiner could find no cause of death. Their hearts all simply stopped around the same time, 4 days before they were found. The medical examiner assumed it was poison, but she couldn't find any traces of it in their bloodstreams. Another mystery was their identity. Their fingerprints didn't come up with any matches, and when pictures of the dead people were released to the media, no one identified them or claimed them. Over the next year, Gleason went to his cabin less than he had ever before. He wasn't afraid that his cabin was haunted, but just the fact that 4 strange, unidentified people died there for unknown reasons made him less enthusiastic to sleep there alone. Gleason tried not to think about the incident, and he only knew it was past the 1-year anniversary because someone from the newspaper called him for a quote. Gleason decided it was silly to avoid the cabin, so about 3 weeks after the anniversary, he drove up to the cabin. When he opened the door, he was again hit with the unmistakable stench of death. He drove to the gas station and called the police. This time, they found 8 dead bodies, 5 women and 3 men, all of them completely hairless. They were all wearing the white tracksuits, and all of them died for unknown reasons. And finally, no one identified or claimed the bodies. After the mass death, Gleason tried to sell the cabin, but there were no buyers. On the 3rd anniversary, the police set up a surveillance detail in the days leading up to April 16th, but there was no activity at the cabin. Gleason was finally able to sell the cabin, which was demolished, and a cottage was built on the land. No reports of weird activity have been reported there since. The police speculate that the people were members of a suicide cult. However, since not one of the 12 bodies were ever identified, it's unclear how or why they died and why they chose Gleason's cabin as the place to leave this world. Number 3. The Plane Crash. On December 20, 1997, Emmanuel Jordan was traveling with his father in a small plane over the vast expanse of forested area that covers central British Columbia. Suddenly, without reason, the plane's engines stopped. The pilot couldn't get them started again, and the plane crashed. 6 passengers and the pilot were killed in the crash, but miraculously, Emmanuel only broke 2 ribs. His father, Elliot, also survived the crash, but he couldn't walk. He thought his back was broken. Emmanuel waited for 2 hours, but he became unsure that anyone would come looking for them. It was just getting close to noon, and he didn't want to be stuck in the woods in the middle of the night with his paralyzed father, so he decided to set out and try to find some help. Luckily, he found a compass in the wreckage, and he remembered flying over Prince George about an hour prior to the crash, so he started to walk in that direction. About 5 hours through the thick, snow-covered woods, Emmanuel hadn't found a road, and he was now worried that he was lost in the woods and it was getting dark. That is when he first saw a sign of life. It was a cabin. It was dark, but Emmanuel ran to it. When he got to it, he found that the door and the shutter on the windows were locked with padlocks. He looked around, and not far from the cabin was a small shed. As he got close to it, an incredibly unpleasant smell hit him like a punch in the face. Despite this, he tried to get in, but it too was locked. However, beside the shed, he found an axe. He picked it up and noticed what looked like dark red paint on it. He ignored the paint and used the axe to knock the lock off the door. When he opened the door and stepped inside, he was amazed to see a large sculpture in the middle of the one-room cabin. It looked like a giant elk, complete with antlers. It had a wire-meshed body and head, and the forelegs were covered in what looked like leather. Turning his gaze from the half-finished elk, Emmanuel looked around the rest of the cabin, and he found more model animals covered in different colored leathers. There were 20 models in all, and they were all smaller animals like raccoons, rabbits, and beavers. Besides the animals, there was a bed in the corner of the room. Hoping there was something that could possibly help him, Emmanuel decided to break into the putrid-smelling shed. When he did, he discovered where the leather came from. The inside of the shed was covered with blood, and there were pieces of human skin hanging from a clothesline. One of the pieces was clearly the face of a victim. Emmanuel threw up and slammed the shed door closed. It was now dark, and Emmanuel had no choice but to spend the night in the cabin with the animal models covered in human skin. He didn't sleep much, and at first light he set out for help. Within 20 minutes, he found a road and flagged down a passing car about 10 minutes later. Search and rescue found the wreckage, and Emmanuel's dad did survive, but he was paralyzed from the waist down. The police also went to the cabin and collected the models. In total, they found the skin from 33 people in the house and in the shed. They scavenged the area, and the flayed bodies of 33 men and women were found buried in shallow graves. All of them were sex workers from all over British Columbia. The first one went missing 3 years prior, while the latest one only vanished 2 days before her skin was found. Police were never able to identify who the killer was. The cabin was illegally built, and the fingerprints they found didn't match any known criminal. However, they believe that the killer was a trucker, since the victims came from all over the province. It's also believed that he probably had a background in construction, since he probably built the cabin himself. He also probably has experience working as a leather tanner because the skins looked like they were made into a leather by a professional. The police's biggest concern is possibly that the killer may have a new cabin somewhere else. Number 2. The Jefferson family's last trip to the cabin. In August 2000, the Jefferson family of Ann Arbor, Michigan, which consisted of Mark and Lisa and their children, Jasmine and Michael, decided to visit their one-room cabin on Lake Michigan one last time. The cabin was just getting too cramped now that Jasmine was 17 and Michael was 15. On their last trip, the family had a great day, and they used their boat and did some water skiing. After a barbecue and a fire that included s'mores, the Jefferson family went to bed around 8:30 p.m. They later said that they were all incredibly tired, but they had a long day, so no one thought it was weird that they felt so sluggish and tired that early. About 8 hours later, the silence of the morning was shattered by Lisa's screaming while she was standing at the foot of Jasmine's bed. Mark and Michael bolted out of bed, and they also screamed. Jasmine's body was in bed, but her head was gone. They phoned the police who searched the area, but Jasmine's head could not be found. The autopsy showed that Jasmine was alive when she was decapitated with a hacksaw. They also tested her blood and found large amounts of rohypnol and ether. The obvious suspects were the Jefferson family themselves. However, they denied killing her, but they couldn't explain what happened the night before. Their blood was tested, and it too had rohypnol in it. Rohypnol can make people pass out, and it can also cause retrograde amnesia, so the brain is unable to form new memories. That means that even if they did commit the murder, they wouldn't remember it. However, the police didn't believe that the family members were responsible. They found the source of the rohypnol to be the marshmallows, so it's thought that someone poisoned them while the family was out boating. After the family had passed out, the killer entered the house and put a rag with ether over Jasmine's face so she wouldn't wake up when she was being decapitated. The killer then took the head and the hacksaw with him or her. Sadly, this wasn't the end of the tragic story. About 7 years after the murder, Mark woke up and went to get the newspaper on his front step, and on his front doorstep was a gift-wrapped box. He brought the box inside, and there was a card. He opened the card as Lisa came downstairs. It simply said, "Sorry for your loss," on the outside, and there was a picture of a dove. He opened the card, but there was no writing or a signature. Mark just assumed it was a gift from an anonymous person. Ever since the murder, they had received gifts from strangers, so he didn't think it was too odd to find a gift outside of his house. As Lisa watched, Mark tore the wrapping paper off, and there was a box. He removed the lid, and inside there was a jar. He pulled it out, and when Mark realized that he was looking at the pickled head of his dead daughter, he dropped the jar. As it fell, it hit the table, and the jar shattered. The smell was horrific. Lisa and Mark got out of the house and called the police. The police came, but there were no clues as to who dropped off the head. Mark and Lisa sold their house and moved to whereabouts unknown. Number 1. The Weekend Getaway. On June 24, 1983, Sarah and Ron Childs, along with another couple, Shane and Deborah Cowles, went to Ron's father's hunting cabin just outside of Chattanooga, Tennessee. When the two couples, who were all in their early 20s, didn't return home to Nashville on Sunday night and no one answered the phone at the cabin, Ron's father phoned the sheriff's department in Hamilton County. They sent an officer over and he found the Jeep that the couples drove parked near the cabin. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He turned the handle and pushed the door open. As he did, the strong iron smell of blood immediately hit him. When he looked inside, he immediately noticed that the cabin was covered in blood. It was such a shock to him that he felt too terrified to go into the cabin alone, so he called for backup. The sheriff's team entered the cabin, and they found Deborah Cowles in the living room. She was sitting with her back against the wall with her arms outstretched, and someone had driven nails through her wrists and pinned her to the wall. It was as if she was crucified in a sitting position against the wall. As they got closer to her, they saw that her face was covered in dry blood. Her pulse was checked, and amazingly, she was alive. The EMTs were brought in and they examined Deborah, who wasn't conscious, and the EMTs made a startling discovery. Deborah's eyelids had been cut off. The fire department was brought in to get her off the walls. Deborah woke up when they started removing the first nail, and she started screaming. Deborah was taken to the hospital where she was sedated. While she was under, she was stitched up and bandages were placed over her eyes. However, the doctors had determined that she had already gone blind. While Deborah was in the hospital, the search for her husband and her friends continued. Unfortunately, there was enough blood covering the cabin that the police knew they were looking for their dead bodies. When Deborah was conscious, she wasn't much help in explaining what had happened. She was near catatonic, and the only thing she could say was, "Stop," or "Please stop." After several weeks of investigating, the police believe they knew what happened and knew why Deborah kept saying stop. On the Sunday afternoon, just as the two couples were getting ready to leave the cabin, they were surprised by a group of people. According to the footprints found in the cabin, there were at least 6 people, and 2 of them were possibly women. Why they targeted Deborah Cowles is unclear, but they got her against the wall, hammered the nails into her wrists, and cut off her eyelids because they wanted to make sure that she saw what they did to her friends. Sadly, since Deborah went blind, it was one of the last things that she ever saw. As for what happened to her husband and friends, the police think that due to the amount of blood on the living room floor in front of Deborah, that they were probably murdered in front of her. How they died is a mystery because their bodies were never found. However, due to the amount of blood found in the cabin, it is believed that they were cut or stabbed and possibly drained of their blood. The final mystery is who were the 6 people that are responsible for this triple homicide. The Sheriff's Department is hoping that one day one of them will feel guilty enough to turn themselves in. Subscribe for more.